Tia Clark, and I'm the Senior Community Outreach and Engagement Manager at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. Welcome to the first in a series of on-demand videos hosted by our Center for Translational Research on Cannabis and Cancer. As many of you know, New York State legalized cannabis for recreational adult use in 2021, and we hope to delve into some of the ins and outs of what this new law means for you and your loved ones as you navigate the cannabis landscape. At Roswell Park, we have a group of dedicated experts who are leading the charge on scientific evidence and research as it relates to cancer prevention, care, and public health. Thank you for joining me today. For our first topic, we are going to start with the basics of Cannabis 101, and I have a great panel gathered here today. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Danielle Smith. She is the assistant professor with Roswell Park's Department of Health Behaviors, who specializes in topics related to cannabis and nicotine use. Thank you for being here. And also I have Ms. Annette Colden. Ms. Annette Colden is a breast cancer survivor, and she is also the founder and business owner of We Are As One Cancer Support Group, and she's here to learn more about cannabis use so that she can share it with the many people that she comes in contact with that has questions about cannabis in the community. Thank you for being here, Annette.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So thank you for taking part in this important conversation. So let's really get into this, what is Cannabis 101? And so my first question is the terms. We hear so many terms surrounding cannabis, and sometimes they call it marijuana, but we're focusing on cannabis, that term cannabis, and maybe you can talk about that, the difference of using the terminology first, cannabis and marijuana, and then all of the letters that come with it. We have THC and CBD, there's Delta and hemp. So tell me more about what's the difference?
Yeah, there's so much going on with cannabis these days, and it's one thing I like to open with when I talk to people about cannabis is when we talk about cannabis, we're really talking about a couple of different things. When we're talking about what's occurring in our new legal environment, we're really talking about adult use cannabis or marijuana. So these are talking about products that typically people use to get intoxicated or feel high. Another version of the cannabis plant is called hemp, and hemp is a version of the plant that typically does not get people high. So there's two different versions of the cannabis plant. When we say adult use cannabis, we're talking about marijuana, or we can talk about industrial hemp, which doesn't get people high. So these two types of plants are typically differentiated by something called a cannabinoid called THC. So cannabinoids are these constituents that are found in the plant, and they're responsible for the plant's effects. And THC is the cannabinoid that's responsible for producing the intoxicating or high effect that comes from cannabis. So in adult use cannabis, we have very high levels of THC, whereas in hemp, there are typically very low to no levels of THC. Another cannabinoid that people typically hear a lot about is cannabidiol or CBD. So with CBD, we typically see very low concentrations in adult use cannabis and very high concentrations in industrial hemp. CBD is also the cannabinoid that's responsible for a lot of the therapeutic effects of cannabis. So when you see a lot of these CBD products, CBD is the chief cannabinoid responsible for therapeutic effects. And you'll also see a lot of these newer products on the market, products like Delta 8 and THCO. And these are synthetic derivatives. So these are laboratory manufactured products that come from hemp, but what happens is they're made in a laboratory and they supercharge these Delta 8 and THCO cannabinoids up to levels that would never naturally be present in the plant. So these are synthetic products, and they're nothing that would actually be found in nature.
Wow, that's a lot of information. That's a lot. Now, can you tell me what is allowed and what isn't allowed under the new law?
So what this new law does is it creates a legal adult use cannabis marketplace. And now what this means is that adults age 21 or older can now buy, possess, and consume adult use cannabis in certain circumstances or in certain situations. With purchasing and possession, adults can purchase up to 3 ounces of cannabis flower. So that's what we think of as marijuana, like the plant material. They can also purchase or possess up to 24 ounces of cannabis extract. So these are things like vaping cartridges or other types of liquid extracts from cannabis. With consumption, consumption is typically allowed within a private residence. It's allowed to be consumed anywhere that tobacco products are consumed. And it's also allowed to, what's going to be happening in this new emerging marketplace is there will be these outlets called consumption lounges. So you could think of that kind of like a bar that people would go to consume cannabis expressly. We do know that under the new law, cannabis is not allowed to be consumed in motor vehicles. It's also not allowed to be consumed on federal property.
Now, in addition to smoking and inhaling cannabis, there are so many new products out right now. We see them all the time, like edibles and drinks. Are these products safe to use as well?
So there's a lot that scientists are still working on to really understand the safety profiles of a lot of these new products. What we can kind of say at this point is that if you're getting any products from this newly emerging market, it's really important to buy things that are from state licensed outlets. We do know that the products that are sold in these outlets tend to be subject to laboratory testing and quality control testing. Anything that's purchased from a non-state licensed outlet or from the street, we can't, people don't know what's in them. There might be contaminants like heavy metals or pesticides or other things that could adversely impact your health. So we typically advise that people don't consume those types of products.
Yeah. And Annette, I know you do a lot of work also with smoking, nicotine use, and there's always cannabis questions in there. So what have you heard from community?
Basically, when we were talking about tobacco, it always follow up with marijuana. So my question is, and with me dealing with cancer survivors, is it something that's addictive? Because a lot of their medication that they take, unfortunately, it is addictive. Is this anyway at all addictive?
So cannabis, you can often think about cannabis similar to alcohol. It's a situation where you don't want to do it too much of it, you don't want to do it too often, and you want to do it in safe circumstances. There is a potential for cannabis to become addictive or problematic for some people. And we know that between 10 and 30% of people who consume cannabis do develop a formal cannabis use disorder. This typically tends to happen with people who are over consuming cannabis, or people who have started using cannabis at a very, very young age, or have other types of characteristics that make them more vulnerable to problematic use. These are things like having certain mental health issues. So in those situations, there's a greater likelihood that people might have problems with cannabis. But if people are practicing responsible consumption, then the risk of having problematic use with cannabis is pretty low.
Okay. Now, they put in the CBD in a lot of different things. So I was told, go get the sheets. They put them in the sheets. So I went and bought the sheets. And I did have a very peaceful sleep. So is that something I should be concerned about? Should I not sleep on them every night? Maybe sleep on them once or twice a week?
That's a great question. Science, like I said, scientists are really trying to understand what the ultimate health effects are from getting different types of exposure to CBD from different sources, whether it be ingested or inhaled, or whether it be sheets that you sleep on. So really the jury's still out on kind of the safety associated with that.
Okay, thank you.
Now, to follow up with that, Annette said that she felt relaxed. So what are the other feelings that people may experience when using cannabis?
Yeah, so with cannabis, cannabis affects different people differently. So people tend to report both positive and not so positive effects following use, and it's really person dependent. In terms of positive effects, people tend to report that makes them feel better, makes them feel happier, it enhances their mood, enhances their creativity. It can heighten senses in really interesting ways for people, so their taste, their touch, their hearing, sight, smell, things like that. On the not so positive side, there are a lot of people reporting that cannabis use can make them feel a lot more anxious. It can lead to physical symptoms like dry mouth, red, itchy eyes. And it can also, particularly if overconsumed, it can lead to a kind of hungover feeling for some folks. So it affects different people differently, and these effects also tend to vary based on how the cannabis is consumed. So people sometimes respond differently to smoking or vaping it compared to eating it or ingesting it in an oil or some other mechanism.
Okay, well, I do have a question about vaping it. Is that more dangerous in regards to, because when you vape with tobacco, I know that's very harmful. So I was just curious about the vaping of the cannabis.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. We had several years ago, there was actually a vaping illness outbreak that took place, but that was because of a contaminant in vaped THC products that were acquired from the illegal market. We typically didn't see that problem occurring with products that were purchased from state-regulated outlets. With vaping products, ultimately, the jury's still out on that too. That's actually science that we're actively working on at Roswell Park to try and understand some of the health effects for respiration, for mental health, and for other issues that are associated with these new vaping products. So there's still a lot of science to be done on this product. Right now, we just tend to recommend if people are going to vape cannabis that they purchase dry herb vaporizers and they vape the actual flower instead of the liquid forms of the drug.
Great, thank you.
Now, Dr. Smith, from your research, what would you consider a concerning, for somebody that's using cannabis, that it's starting to be a issue of concern, whether they're exhibiting like different behaviors or the overuse of it? Is there a way to tell, that it's concerning and maybe they should not use cannabis?
So I typically wouldn't recommend any sort of cannabis use for individuals who have experienced or have a close relative that have experienced serious mental health problems, bipolar disorder, serious depression. We do know that cannabis can exacerbate some of the symptoms of these illnesses, so these are typically like flags that we would say avoid consumption in those circumstances. In terms of problematic use, anybody that's starting to increase their consumption, so if you're increasing cannabis use and you need more to get the feeling of intoxication, that's typically a sign that you need to cool it on consuming the cannabis.
And so along the same lines, how can a person consume recreational cannabis responsibly?
So, like I said before, you really can think about it the same way that you would think about alcohol. Not too much, not too often, consume in safe circumstances. There's still a lot we're trying to understand about cannabis, but a couple things that we do know about responsible use practices is that you want to avoid consuming daily or close to every day, so just use infrequently. Try to avoid smoked methods of delivery. This way you're protecting your respiration and your lungs. You want to avoid products that have very high levels of THC. We do know that products with very high levels of THC tend to create anxiety or exacerbate mental health issues in people. We also know that cannabis use is really best consumed after adulthood, so consuming early in life typically tends to be linked to more problems associated with use. We also tell folks that are pregnant or nursing, don't consume cannabis. We know that that can create problems for the fetus, and people that have cardiovascular problems or respiratory health problems. We recommend that not avoiding cannabis consumption in those circumstances. Also, not combining alcohol or tobacco with cannabis, because the interactive effects of those drugs can exacerbate some of the more adverse health effects of cannabis. So,
now, Dr. Smith, if somebody is considering using cannabis, what are some of the considerations around employment that they should be concerned about?
That's a really great question, because even though we have this new state law, under this new state law, employers are still, okay to make whatever rules they want to about cannabis and its use among employees based on the natures of the job that they're performing. So if you're in a profession, for instance, where you're driving or you're operating heavy machinery, your employer might have very specific rules about cannabis consumption relative to folks in other professions. So we typically recommend that people check with their employers and see what the rules are about cannabis before they go engaging in recreational consumption.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Smith. That information, I'm sure, is so informative and it will help others. And thank you, Annette, for those questions. I'm sure other people had the same questions. And so thank you for watching as well. This was our first topic, and thank you for joining us. If you want more information about cannabis and cannabis research, please visit Roswell Park. The website is roswellpark.org/cannabis research. Have a great day.